Chapter 35, Falcon's Wings, Setzer Gabuni. The afternoon sun was hitting Celes and Sabin hard as they crouched on the bandits' ship, having managed to climb on when Garrett had turned his back to board. They were both sitting behind a huge stack of crates, sweating and not daring to say a word. Celes's eyes began to feel heavy, and before she knew it, she had passed out against Sabin's shoulder. By the time they had arrived in a port, Sabin was shaking her shoulders to get her to wake up.
"Come on, Celes, we've landed somewhere. Looks like South Figaro."
Celes blinked and opened her eyes, trying to focus. The town was indeed South Figaro, and for the most part, it seemed like not much had changed. In fact, the town actually looked better than from Celes had last seen. The damage the Empire occupancy had caused was all rebuilt. People were still filling the streets, going to and from wherever and shopping at the roadside vendors. Garrett and crew immediately filed off of the ship, leaving most of their supplies behind. As Celes and Sabin crept behind them, Garrett suddenly dropped something shiny and turned around, bending to pick it up and glaring at a shocked Celes and Sabin. He grabbed what he had dropped, a coin, no less, and narrowed his eyes.
"Are you people still here? Be polite now, Edgar,"
Celes snapped.
"Really, what are you doing?"
Sabin exclaimed.
"Boss, everyone is ready,"
a bandit cried, and Garrett turned away, ignoring Sabin's question.
"A case of mistaken identity, my dears. Give it up."
Their chase of Garrett lasted that whole afternoon. He led the returners and the bandits through the Figaro cave, and along the way, Celes was assaulted with the fading memories of her and Locke's battle inside of it. She remembered how pissed off she was back then, that this punk had just come out of nowhere to rescue her like some damsel in distress. Oh, but how she wished they were back in those simpler times now. Back then, Celes's only problems were that she was branded an imperial traitor and that she had no choice but to stick with these rogue returners, enemies of her enemies. Now though, her enemies had become her friends, and it was like each one of them had disappeared with a piece of her heart. Worse yet, it was not an empire that was her enemy now. It was a psychotic, godlike figure, and the dying world that hid her comrades within it. Near the end of the cave, instead of turning out of the exit like Celes and Locke had, Garrett stopped near a spring and kneeled down. Celes and Sabin, not too far behind, watched concernedly.
"Why is he stopping?" "I dunno." "Hey turtle!"
Garrett suddenly exclaimed, and Celes and Sabin looked at each other, the same expression written on both their faces.
"What?" "Here boy, here's some nice food for you."
There was a slight splashing sound, and all of a sudden, from under the waters of the spring, a huge, ancient turtle appeared, swimming slowly towards Garrett and craning its neck to see what was in his hand. When he was finally close enough, Garrett extended his hand more, and the turtle began to eat from it gratefully. Celes just stared. She had never seen anything like that turtle in her life. It was so massive. With that, Garrett stood up, and leapt on the turtle's back. The turtle let out a low moan-like noise and ferried Garrett across the spring, where he hopped off across to the other side and disappeared through an opening in the rocky wall.
I used to have a turtle once,"
Garrett sang as he disappeared, and Sabin stood up.
"Okay, that is definitely Edgar. You and Edgar used to have a turtle."
Celes smiled.
"No, he had the turtle. And, he ended up losing it a week later. Did you ever find it? Well, apparently, our royal chef did. Oh. Oh.
Celes made a face, and Sabin laughed nervously. On that happy note, Celes took the lead and gestured the turtle over, luring it to her and Sabin so that they could cross also. The path through the opening was rocky and narrow, but it was also straight, so they couldn't get lost. After a few minutes of tedious walking, they suddenly spotted light ahead of them. It was another opening, one that looked recently made. The pickaxe that had probably helped create it was stuck in a wall nearby. After shifting through the rubble and stepping inside, Celes and Sabin found themselves in
Figaro Castle.
Sabin blinked.
Figaro Castle's dungeon, no less.
Celes corrected, for in front of them were the classic metal jail bars that kept the criminals from running amok. To her right, there were more bars, and to her left, a stone wall. However, the door to the cell was wide open and gently swinging on its hinges, so someone had obviously just come through and given it a hard push when they made their exit.
Well, you know your way around here.
Celes gave Sabin a push ahead.
So start walking. But something doesn't seem right.
Sabin countered, wearily reaching up and taking a lit torch from its stand on the wall.
Look at all this sand.
Their feet scraped against the huge piles of sand as they walked along towards the exit of the dungeon, and Celes sighed.
Of course there is sand, we're underground, remember? I bet we're smack under the Figaro Desert. But if we're truly underground, that means there is no way we're getting to the surface parts of the castle.
Sabin frowned as they stepped through the exit of the dungeon and looked around. They were in a small antechamber, and the only other access they had to anything was the set of descending stairs across from them. The doors ahead were blocked with a solid dune of sand, and the doors below led to the outside, which Sabin was not too particularly eager to see at the moment.
So what's that?
Celes asked, pointing to the other stairs.
Well, that's just the switch room.
Sabin replied, thinking carefully.
And there was nothing in there except the switch to make the castle move and the guard whom always yelled at Edgar and I. Why did he always yell at you? Well, there are also stairs in there that led to the engine of the castle itself, and of course, Edgar being the way he is, always wanted to tinker with it. But we never really got to sneak down there. Well, that's where Edgar has to be right now.
Celes concluded.
I bet he's using those bandits to help him fix the castle. It's a possibility,
Sabin said, and gestured for her to follow.
Let's go, but be careful. All I heard about this place was that it was dangerous.
So with that, the two returners crept into the switch room and found the staircase that Edgar had so wanted to traverse from his younger days. The stairs led to what seemed like a maze, just rows and rows of corridors and chambers with all sorts of complicated switches, and some with treasure boxes loaded with supplies for maintenance. It was also crawling with underground monsters that had slithered into the castle, but Celes and Sabin dispatched of them quickly and moved on. Eventually, the pair came to a long, wide corridor that led to a huge pair of metal double doors. Outside of it stood Garrett, kneeling over a bandit that had swooned on the floor.
You all right?
Garrett asked.
You were almost a goner.
There was no reply, and Garrett stood up, brushing off his clothes.
So, apparently, our problem is in there.
Garrett said, motioning towards the double doors.
What a mess. That monster in there wiped Mikey right out.
A bandit squealed.
And how are we gonna get back there? That's where our treasure be. I have a plan.
Garrett said, putting his hands on his hips.
You get into the back room, and I'll keep the monster busy. But boss, that's dangerous. Just go.
Garrett barked, and they all jumped, looking at each other and suddenly forcing their way through the double doors. Celes could hear the pounding footsteps fade away, and the angry roar of something. Garrett turned and started to go through the doors himself.
Edgar!
Celes suddenly cried, running down the corridor and causing Garrett to stop dead in his tracks. He turned around and put his hands on his hips.
Well, what are you waiting for, Celes? Give me a hand. Edgar!
Celes exclaimed happily.
I knew it was you. Brother!
Sabin exclaimed with her, running down the corridor and giving Edgar a huge bear hug. Edgar laughed and hugged his brother back gratefully.
Let's save the reunion special for later,
Edgar said.
There seriously is a dangerous monster in there. I think it's what caused the castle to suspend underground. I'm all for a good fight.
Sabin grinned, flexing his huge arm. Edgar, leading the group, burst through the metal doors, and Celes gasped. Surrounding them on their tiny bridge was nothing but churning metal and machinery, but there was something wrong. It made struggling, grinding noises, and consuming a great deal of it was a bright yellow, glowing, tentacle-like being. Celes could see nothing but hundreds and hundreds of tiny, slimy tentacles pulsating everywhere.
Is this whole thing the monster?
Celes asked, and Edgar nodded.
Yes, but it is not the part we must finish off.
As he was speaking, 4 huge, swinging tentacles seemingly crept up from nowhere behind the heroes. They were at least 25 feet high, and as thick as some of the most ancient trees. One of the tentacles rushed down, wrapping its slimy self around Celes's waist and yanking her up, holding her upside down and causing her to let out a stream of curses.
H-E-E-E-E-E-L-L-L-L-L-L-L-L-L-L-P. Celes!
The Figaro brothers cried in unison, and with that, Edgar withdrew his auto crossbow, and Sabin prepared to pounce with his claw.
Behind you!
Celes shrieked, and just in time, Sabin turned around and swiped away a tentacle that was ready to assault him. Celes, moaning and struggling, managed to grasp at a weapon underneath the tentacle, willing it to activate. However, she suddenly felt an electric shock rip through her body, and she felt her energy start to drain from her limbs, as if someone had pulled her plug.
Ah!
Celes moaned, and felt her eyes starting to get heavy.
Come on! Atma!
But nothing happened, and Chere's words came back to Celes in a hazy flashback.
That hilt you hold is actually a sword, but its power reflects the power of the user. No good!
Celes yawned, and suddenly passed out, limp. Meanwhile, Edgar had been struggling to aim at the tentacle that held Celes captive, but it kept evading his flying arrows and trying to use Celes as a shield. Sabin had managed to destroy one of the tentacles, but now there were still 3 more to go.
Brother!
Sabin cried.
What are we going to do? I haven't the foggiest.
Edgar squealed.
But perhaps I could distract this thing with my arrows, and you could go in for the kill. Just don't hit Celes,
Sabin said, and Edgar nodded.
I'll be careful.
Edgar started shooting a little more off target now, but it was still enough to get the tentacle to flip out and start dodging. Meanwhile, Sabin dashed past Edgar and with one hard swing, sliced the tentacle open and caused a low growl to erupt within the machinery. The tentacle withered about and dropped Celes, who landed on the metal bridge with a heavy thump. As Sabin finished off her captor, Edgar kneeled to her side.
Celes? Can you hear me? Triple M.
Celes murmured, and opened her eyes halfway.
I need something. Here.
Edgar dug around in his robes and pulled out a high potion, popping the cork out of the top and forcing the red, see-through liquid down Celes's throat. She coughed a little, but felt as if her energy and warmth was flooding back into her, drowning her senses and sending her into hyperdrive.
Thanks, Edgar,
she exclaimed, leaping to her feet and drawing the magnificent Atma, which had regained its regal blue blade. With a cry and a running charge, Celes thrust the blade through the second tentacle behind Sabin and sliced it clean in half. Edgar, abandoning his crossbow for now, drew his own sword and following through with Celes, slashed the final tentacle. At this final blow, the whole room began to quiver and shake, and the baby tentacles on the machinery began to shrivel up and shrink, until they all disappeared in a burst of purple light. The machinery began to purr and click more smoothly now, and the team let out a gasp as they felt themselves begin to move. No, Figaro Castle beginning to move. Everyone looked at each other, grinning, and sheathed their respective weapons. Celes walked over to Edgar, and gave him a rough poke in the chest.
So, why the stupid farce?
Celes demanded, her happiness now turning into rage. Edgar laughed nervously and kept himself well hidden behind Sabin.
I swear, I had good reasoning behind all of it,
Edgar explained.
While traveling around, looking for you fine people, I heard that Figaro Castle had had an accident. However, I had no idea where to look. Then, I heard that those idiots had escaped from the prison in the process. Oh!
Celes grinned.
You needed to use them. Bingo! I had to wait to gain their trust and get them to lead me to their secret entrance that they had escaped out of. I disguised myself as a thief and told them that all of their treasure the horrible, oppressive King Edgar had revoked from them was down in the engine rooms. That's pretty amazing, considering you were the one who threw most of them in jail to begin with,
Celes exclaimed.
It was a good disguise. But not good enough for my darling Celes, right?
Edgar purred, and reached out to touch her cheek.
My gods, you have only grown more beautiful since we last met. Cut it out!
Celes barked, and slapped Edgar's hand away quite efficiently. Edgar squealed and Sabin stepped back.
Don't treat us like strangers anymore, okay?
Sabin demanded.
We had nothing but crap getting over here, and you just added to it. Okay, I'm sorry, but like I said, it was for the greater good.
Edgar whined. Suddenly, they heard the grumbling of the bandits, and Edgar dashed behind some machinery.
Hurry, let's hide.
Everyone did, and a few moments later, the bandits emerged from the treasure room just beyond the bridge, looking around confusedly.
Boss! Boss! Must have gotten eaten by that thing. It wasn't even that much of a monster.
With that, they filed out, each carrying armloads of what looked like sacks and some old relics. When the coast was clear, Celes, Sabin, and Edgar emerged, looking at each other.
You don't want that treasure back, bro?
Sabin questioned, and Edgar shook his head.
It's completely worthless,
Edgar replied, and frowned a little.
Besides, Kefka's the one we need to worry about. Those guys haven't committed any serious crimes, not compared to him. Oh Edgar, you have no idea how happy I am to hear you say that.
Celes sighed in relief, and Edgar looked at her confusedly.
It's been a very trying journey for us, Edgar,
Sabin said gently.
Perhaps we should sit down somewhere and talk about it. You need to catch up. But first, we should get to the surface.
Edgar smiled.
But isn't there a problem with the engine? It's been solved now, brother,
Edgar exclaimed, opening his arms to accentuate his words.
The next stop for Figaro Castle is Kohlingen. Watch your step.
Celes blinked and smiled slightly. Kohlingen was Locke's hometown. After assuring a worried Chancellor that he was just fine, Edgar led the group out of Figaro Castle and they began the short walk to Kohlingen. He decided that it was best for them not to hang around while everyone was busy restoring conduct and order to the buried castle. Celes didn't say anything, but she was desperately anxious to go to Kohlingen anyway, because surely someone knew of Locke there. Perhaps that crazy herb guy that was watching Rachel. She frowned a little and chewed her lip in thought. She wondered if, in fact, Rachel was still alive after everything had happened. Then she paled and chewed more. No, Rachel never was alive. She just wasn't dead, either. She was in limbo. Celes was silent as the team entered Kohlingen and took a look around. This village had not fared as well as South Figaro. A few more homes had collapsed, but were never fixed back up. Rachel's house was still in the south side, as shabby as ever. The gardens of flowers were pale and dead, and the grass was a sickening yellow color. Celes watched sadly as a pair of sisters kneeled over a patch of land, and she could hear the littler one praying that a seed would sprout.
I think the inn is a safe spot to rest,
Edgar suggested. Sabin and he took off, and Celes followed, her hair flying back from her face in a sudden dusty gust of wind. Inside the inn, the whole bar was deserted except for a lone figure sitting alone at a table, playing solitaire with a deck of cards. While Edgar and Sabin left to make negotiations with the innkeeper, Celes walked over to a table near the only window in the bar and sat, gazing out of it and pondering. Was Locke here? She found herself doubting it very highly. She knew that somehow, if he were here, she would be able to sense it right away, and she had felt nothing. She decided right then and there that she was not going to depress herself looking for him. Besides, she didn't want to see that crazy herb bastard or Rachel, whether she was still in one piece or not. Celes knew that would just cloud her mind more than it already was. She decided that yes, it was time to move on. Her personal mission to seek out Locke had become her friend's mission to destroy Kefka. A chapter of her adventures was over. Celes, focus on Kefka. Kefka is the one you must worry about now. Edgar and Sabin wish to fight, and you must aid them. Focus, how are we even going to get to Kefka? He's locked away in that huge tower.
Hey, lady, you're blocking my light.
The man playing solitaire had looked up and was glaring daggers in the back of Celes's head. Not turning around, she narrowed her eyes and continued gazing out the window.
Leave me alone.
The man snorted and stood up now, crossing his arms over his chest, his long, black coat gently sweeping the floor.
Could you at least move to another table? No.
Celes snapped.
I said, leave me the hell alone.
With that, the man stomped over, and roughly grabbed Celes by the shoulder, whipping her around to face him. She gasped in surprise as she looked up, nearly tumbling over in her chair. The man, surprised as well, dropped his hand and took a step back. Celes's heart was pounding 1,000,000 miles an hour in her chest. That long silver hair. Those deep blue eyes. Those 3 intricate scars.
Setzer.
Celes trailed off, not really believing her eyes. Another friend? So soon? Had the tides of fate changed so suddenly in the returner's favor?
You're alive.
Setzer blinked and suddenly enveloped Celes in a tight hug. She didn't resist, she only closed her watering eyes and held him close to her, squeezing tight to assure him that she was. Sabin and Edgar walked in right then, shocked at the sight before them and gasping out in unison, as only twins could do.
Setzer.
Setzer turned around and saw his other friends, gasping and laughing as they ran over and hugged. Celes stayed in her chair, overwhelmed with happiness and hope. They had found a 4th returner. Perhaps things were not as dim as they seemed. After everyone had settled down around a bigger table, Setzer started firing off questions.
Where have you guys been? Well.
Edgar trailed off.
That, I don't know. Ask Celes and Sabin.
Setzer turned his eyes on the two, and they looked at each other.
It's a terribly long story.
Celes sighed.
I've got all the time in the world.
Setzer replied, banging his fists on the table.
Tell me. Well.
Celes began, resting her hand underneath her chin.
It all started when I awoke on this island.
With that, she began to explain the entire tale to Setzer, right up to walking in the inn and sitting down. When she was finished, Setzer sighed and leaned back in his chair.
So, you're looking for Locke now? We're looking for everyone.
Celes insisted.
It's just that. Well, he saved me. I'm sure of it. I just wanted to thank him a last time.
She reached up and touched the bandana around her forehead.
But that's not my main objective anymore. A last time?
Setzer asked, cocking his eyebrow.
It's been decided that even if we can't find everyone, we are still going to fight Kefka.
Sabin said.
That's what has to happen. Even without Chere though?
Edgar asked, having heard this story for the first time as well.
I tried to convince her.
Celes trailed off and sighed.
But she wasn't lying when she said she lost her power. Something has happened to her, although I cannot tell you what. But Sabin and I saw it with our own eyes. She just crumbled.
She looked up at Setzer.
But surely, Setzer. I know how Chere feels.
Setzer interrupted, and Celes blinked.
I mean... Phew, that was quite the adventure you just told me. And I don't know if I have it in me anymore. What?
Celes burst, nearly jumping from her chair.
What are you talking about? Setzer.
Edgar and Sabin both cried.
You have to come along with us.
Celes insisted.
This is Kefka we're talking about. I know, it's Kefka.
Setzer repeated.
And that's the thing. I'm just a gambler. I just want to be left alone. This world is just too chaotic for me. And what's worse, I've lost my wings.
He looked down sadly, and Sabin clenched his fist.
Setzer, to us, you were more than just your airship. That's right.
Celes cried, leaning in.
Before the world collapsed, you fought with all your heart. You were absolutely fearless.
Setzer sighed and looked up at her.
That was then. We can never have that world back.
Celes narrowed her eyes, turning angry and now taking her turn to smash her fist on the table.
You want to live in this world as it is? No? Then do something about it.
Edgar and Sabin looked at each other, and then at Setzer. He was looking down, his long hair hanging in his face. Celes was panting slightly from getting overexcited and yelling so loud. Slowly, Setzer raised his head, but he was grinning.
Mwaha!
He burst out laughing and stood up.
All right. You win. I'm starting to feel lucky.
Celes smiled happily and Sabin and Edgar gave Setzer a double high five. Setzer sighed out happily and stretched, as if he had just woken up from a long self-pity nap.
Thanks. I needed that.
He started to pace the bar anxiously, plans already being calculated in his mind as he took each step.
Yes. Now, let's go visit Daryl's tomb. What?
Celes tried to keep her smile on, but she could have sworn Setzer had just said they were going to visit a tomb. Edgar and Sabin looked at each other confusedly.
Who is Daryl?
Edgar questioned. Setzer looked at his friends and smiled some. The only person he had ever spoken to about Daryl was Chere. And she wasn't here anymore. He decided that while the time wasn't right yet, it would be soon. He would explain when the time came for it.
We're gonna get us another one. Airship, that is.
Celes shivered as they stepped outside the inn that night. All was quiet in the town, and not even a cricket could be heard. Setzer was leading the way, and Sabin was taking up the rear. Celes walked a little faster to catch up with Setzer and made a face.
I do not understand why we have to go in the middle of the night, and to a tomb, no less. Well, we definitely have to go to her tomb for a reason.
Setzer said, and smiled.
And well, it's just funner at night, don't you think?
Celes paled and decided to keep her mouth shut. Daryl's tomb was a good hour's walk away, and the desert that had consumed the surrounding area of Kolingen even more since the world's undoing made the temperature very cold at night. Sabin and Edgar were trying to scare each other with ghost stories, and then Sabin shared his tale of the phantom train with everyone. By the time they had reached the tomb itself, Celes was thoroughly creeped out, and ready to go back to Kolingen. The tomb itself was merely just a mausoleum carved out from a hill of surprisingly green grass and some flowers. After prying open the rusty, iron gate door, Chere led the team down a flight of very narrow, steep, stone stairs. Celes provided some light by using a fire spell on a torch hanging from the wall at the bottom of the steps. It was cold, damp, and musty, and far away, Celes could hear the sound of trickling waters and of creatures that might have been down there with them, enjoying the nightlife. The further down they went, the darker things seemed to get, and the creepier the scenery. Sabin gasped out suddenly as he tripped over a small headstone, grumbling as he hit the floor and scaring the living daylights out of everyone else. Celes turned to help him up, and as she kneeled down, her eyes narrowed to read the headstone that he had tripped over, but it was difficult to make out.
The world is square. The world is square,
Edgar repeated, kneeling down with them.
That doesn't make any bloody sense at all. Does it have to make sense?
Chere grinned, and the three looked up at him.
Whoever was hired to make this tomb was really messed in the head,
Edgar replied snottily.
I mean, really, who puts tombstones within a, well, tomb? Maybe it wasn't the person that made the tomb.
Chere shrugged casually.
Maybe it was someone else inside the tomb. What?
Celes and Edgar both choked, looking at each other.
It's a possibility,
Sabin said, agreeing with Chere.
I mean, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that either. Until the phantom train. Brother, I swear, you hit your head and dreamt all that.
Edgar snapped edgily.
Because there is just no way in hell that really happened. Then ask Shadow or Cyan.
Sabin protested.
They'll defend me. Oh, I'll be sure to ask when I see them,
Edgar said, and stood up, groaning.
How much further? Just a little more,
Chere assured him, and with that, they started again. After a few more corridors and tombstone gardens, the team reached another doorway. Chere started through, and found himself on another long, narrow staircase. He knew that they were close now. Celes, her teeth chattering from the cold, was the last one in line.
This person? Daryl.
Celes suddenly spoke, softly.
She was your friend.
Chere nodded and continued walking, without a beat of hesitation.
Yeah, she was a piece of work. Nothing scared her.
A few moments later, they stopped at a final opening, and Chere turned, his face eerily gaunt in the light of the torch.
Could be anything lurking down here, so keep your eyes peeled.
The team slipped through the door, and there, ahead of them, was a tall altar, made of beautiful white marble and had fresh, blooming roses wrapped in silk ribbons distributed on and around it. Behind the altar was a coffin, closed tightly shut, and covered with a soft, light blue silk cover. A picture of a dove, soaring high, was carved into the altar, and the words encrypted over it were, "Daryl sleeps here." Celes looked around, and then broke away from the group, kneeling down and inhaling some of the flowers. They were definitely fresh, some even still dotted with dew. She looked up, and saw Chere staring down sadly at the altar. Celes realized that he had probably come here very recently, maybe even this morning. No wonder Chere hadn't have wanted to leave Kolingen. He was so close to Daryl here.
This brings back a lot of memories.
Setzer suddenly said, his voice piercing the quiet veil of sadness that had fallen over them. He looked up, a smile still on his face as he spoke.
I remember our last day together like it was yesterday. Setzer.
Edgar trailed off.
You don't have to.
Sabin protested, and he shook his head.
No, it's okay. Despite it being our last day, it is still a happy memory.
He walked around to the side of the coffin, kneeling down and touching the silk covering it. When he lifted his fingers, they were coated in dust.
We were in her workshop, which was in a little isolated corner of this very continent. She had just completed her latest work. The most incredible engine ever known to man. And put it in her very own airship, the Falcon. This experimental airship is probably a bit unstable.
A young, pretty blonde woman, with violet eyes like an amethyst, was slipping on some brown leather flying gloves. She was tall, and hardly waif-like, with a strong frame and all her hair swept up in a wavy ponytail underneath her goggles, which rested on her forehead. Her scarlet-red riding outfit consisted of a button-down red jacket, white blouse underneath, and a short scarlet skirt with matching pants underneath and heavy brown combat boots. She looked to Setzer, whose hands were on his hips.
You can't be serious. What are you trying to prove?
He smirked, and Daryl smirked back.
If something should happen to me, the Falcon's yours. Nonsense!
Setzer nearly exploded.
I'll win the Falcon from you when I whip you in a race. So you'd better clear out of my way.
Daryl burst out into her loud, hardly ladylike laughter, and shook her finger.
Big talk, Buster.
Setzer sighed out happily and he raised his hands from the steering wheel of the blackjack. The wind was whipping through his hair, his coat was blowing back as if they were his own wings, and Daryl's laughter could be heard dancing on the breeze from her airship, the Falcon, beside him.
There's nothing like flying. Come on. Stop lagging back there.
Daryl exclaimed, waving her arms frantically.
Or do you like chewing on my wake? Listen to you.
Setzer laughed, and put his hands back on the wheel, pulling ahead further. Daryl smirked and jerked her ship into a higher gear, sailing right back up to Setzer and this time even surpassing him by a few feet. Setzer looked over at her, and was awestruck. Her blonde locks had been freed from her ponytail thanks to the wind, and were flying everywhere like spun gold. She cupped her hands over her mouth and shouted, not just for him to hear, but for the world.
This time's for real. I'm going to break every record. I'll be known as the woman who flew closest to the stars.
Setzer put his hands on his hips. No way was he gonna finish this race in first place, that was for sure. Today, Daryl's dream was going to come true, and if that left him in the dust, then so be it. Because when it all finally settled, he would still be there, cheering and waving her on. His dream had never been to be the fastest, his dream was for her to be the fastest.
Be back before sunset,
Setzer exclaimed.
I'll be waiting for you on our hill.
Setzer sighed and stood up again.
The wreck of the Falcon was found a full year later.
He was not crying, much to Celes's surprise, but his voice had begun to waver slightly.
I restored the craft, and put it to rest down here. Oh. So it is the falcon that is down here,
Edgar said softly.
And Daryl?
Setzer shook his head. Celes felt her heart skip a beat. All of this. It was merely for show. Merely a monument for the past.
I put it in storage.
Setzer sighed.
I couldn't bear to look at it. But now it just may save us. If Daryl knew. Oh, she would be so proud.
Suddenly, the sound of something rickety could be heard clattering against the stone floor of the tomb. The returners looked up, and watched in horror as through the wall, a purple gas-like cloud rushed in, dragging behind it a wooden cart full of dangling skeletons and rotting bodies. It was transparent, and Celes knew that it was some sort of a ghost. Albeit, an angry ghost.
Everyone, get out of the way!
Setzer cried, and with that cue, the returners dove out of the path of the ghost as it raced through. However, when seeing that it missed its targets, it turned around violently, swinging the transparent cart hard against the altar. Celes almost expected the altar to burst into hundreds of pieces, and charged after them again.
Hey, Edgar, maybe you should ask him if he put in the tombstones,
Sabin said sarcastically.
No thanks, because I have the feeling ours are going to be next.
Edgar suddenly whipped out one of his famous tools, the giant camera he had used in Zozo.
Say cheese, big, purple, and ugly.
With a brilliant flash, the camera exploded into light, and the demon stopped moving for the moment, roaring and quivering as only a purple mass can. To add to its discomfort, Setzer sent out a pack of cards with their razor edges, striking the cloud, but watched in horror as they just sailed through and struck the wall on the other side.
Our weapons can't touch it,
Setzer exclaimed.
Then it's time for a little magic,
Celes declared, raising a hand with her index and middle fingers pointed up, her thumb curled over her pointer and pinky. A soft, white aura began to swirl around her, and as she closed her eyes, she could feel it coming, a new spell, a new cantation to save them and rid the undead from this sacred place forever. And somehow, even though she had never known Daryl in her lifetime, Celes could feel her spirit surrounding them, urging them to fight on.
Holy!
A dazzling white ring descended from the sky, made of an infinite amount of tiny pearls and glittering light. As the pearls surrounded the demon, they closed in, zooming at such a speed that all of a sudden there was a burst of pure, beautiful light. As the sparkles and diamond dust faded away, it could be seen that there was nothing that remained behind. All of the torches and candles in the room burst to life, beautiful, golden flames lighting the room and revealing the arched doorway behind Daryl's resting place.
Wow!
Sabin trailed off, taking a step forward and looking around.
It's really pretty. Thanks, Celes,
Setzer exclaimed.
Where did you learn a spell like that? I don't know.
Celes smiled some.
It honestly just came to me. I thought that after sleeping for 2 years, my powers would have stopped developing. Let's hope not.
Edgar smiled.
We're going to need those to rip Kefka a new one.
Celes approached Setzer, and rested a hand on his shoulder as Edgar and Sabin started for the opening in the back of the room. Setzer looked up at Celes and smiled.
I think Daryl would have wanted to be in the returners if she were here today,
Celes said happily.
What do you think? Oh, I don't doubt it.
Setzer's smile turned into a playful smirk.
But I think she would try to out you as leader if she were around.
Celes blinked and smiled some.
Me, leader? Yeah, who do you think is running this crack operation?
Setzer patted her back and started on ahead. Celes stood there, just watching him for a moment, and shook her head, running to catch up with him.
Crack operation? Did anyone tell you I used to be a general?
The next morning, Celes awoke in her very own chamber on the Falcon, in a soft, heavenly feather bed. She sat up and stretched, feeling the warm sunshine bathe her body and feeling the best that she could remember in, 2 years. Climbing up to the deck of the sleek new airship, she spotted Sabin and Edgar, chatting away, and Setzer steering his new prize with the greatest of ease.
I finally think we're gonna pull this off,
Edgar declared, looking up at Celes. She nodded eagerly, and ran her hand over a smooth railing.
Now we can attack Kefka's tower from the air.
Setzer came over to the group, and Sabin put his arms behind his head in a stretch. Edgar gently curled his fingers into a fist.
The Falcon's going to give us one last chance at that guy.
Setzer put both his hands on the railing and looked down at the world speeding by underneath them in a blur of earth tones.
But first we need to find our friends, right?
Celes looked up at him, surprised. Edgar nodded, and put his hands on his hips.
Right. First things first. For once I feel hopeful.
Celes was so happy, she didn't know what to say. They wouldn't be fighting alone. Surely, if the others saw them together, they would want to join the returners again. There was no way they could not. And that also meant maybe she could see Locke again. Suddenly, something soft and white flew right past Celes's shoulder, letting out a chirp and soaring back into the sky ahead of the Falcon. Celes gasped and narrowed her eyes, raising her hand to her forehead so that she could see ahead.
Hey!
Celes exclaimed.
A bird!
The others looked at her strangely, but she was suddenly very excited. This was a sign. Maybe even from Locke. He was still waiting for her, somewhere, calling her name.
Setzer! Follow that bird!
Setzer raised his eyebrows, but actually turned to take the steering wheel, perplexed by the intensity in her gaze.
But why?
Celes stared at him blankly and then shook her head. She walked to the head of the ship, and reached out with her hand, feeling the wind pass through her fingers. The bird was still in view. Very barely, but it was still there, fluttering its delicate, white wings. It seemed to be getting ready to descend. Celes's hair blew back from her face, revealing the bandana still tied on her forehead. She still had yet to remove it since waking up on the beach from her fall.
I don't know,
she finally replied.
Something inside just tells me it's important.
36. Enigmatic Soul, Cyan Garamond. Chapter End.